Welcome back to another video and podcast from the team at Fantasy Football Scout. I'm Sam from FPL Family, and I am yet again joined by one of our brilliant editorial team. Marc, how are you?
Thanks for that introduction, first of all. I'm pretty good. I think being British, it's hard to not turn this into a polite chuckle about weather. But so I'm fine, basically. I'll just stay away from that. It was actually a good weekend.
It is rather hot, isn't it? It's rather hot in the UK. For those of you that are abroad, we are unable to cope with any heat here in the United Kingdom. So I've got my fan on behind me because, quite frankly, I'm not dealing very well with the temperatures here in the UK. That's for sure.
I don't know if we'll get much sympathy.
I don't think we will.
Certain countries.
It was interesting because one of the other content creators who I speak to quite regularly, who lives out in the Middle East, I posted something on my stories the other day and he said, Sam, it's 23 degrees. It's not even that hot. I was like, yes, but it was 7 a.m. and it was 23 degrees. Now, for us in the UK, that is very, very hot. And when I left the office to come home yesterday, it was 35. And I was like, I was very, very grateful that my commute back out of London is on the Elizabeth line, which is fully air conditioned. So I lived the dream a bit like Marc. Our teams are, both of us, playing. Did you like my link there? That was nice, wasn't it? That was smooth. Yeah. Exciting times for both of us this season. The 25-26 campaign, Marc, it marks the return of both Newcastle and Spurs competing in the Champions League. Now, we can't let that go. We have to talk about it. So we are here today to talk about the impact of European football on FPL, because obviously we could sit here and wax lyrical about our teams in the Champions League and what that might mean in terms of how far they might get in the competition or not in the other case. But I think more importantly for most people listening to this or watching this over on YouTube, it's about what impact is it going to have on us as FPL managers, because we saw it last time that Newcastle were in the Champions League, not the best Premier League season. We certainly saw it with Spurs with the promotion of the Europa League over everything else last season. Nothing else mattered. It was all about the Europa League. And of course, now that has meant 17th position finish in the league, but Champions League football. So there's clearly an impact of European football on what happens in the Premier League, and then, of course, in turn, in what happens in FPL. So I think it's important that we kind of look at that and we reflect on what that might mean. Now, obviously, we haven't seen any even pre-season balls kick from a lot of teams yet, although we are getting some insight into a couple of the Champions League teams as they play at the Club World Cup right now. But there's going to be a lot that changes. But I think we can look back at what's happened previously with these teams when they've been playing in European competition, and we can think about the impact that that might have on the new season. So today we're going to be focusing on the teams that are playing in Europe. So that's not just in the Champions League. That, of course, includes the Europa League and the Conference League also. So Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool, Manchester City, Newcastle and Spurs. Excellent. All playing UCL football next season. Meanwhile, we've got Aston Villa and currently at time of recording Crystal Palace playing in the Europa League. Now, there is some debate about what happens with Palace and obviously the ownership issues and whether they're eligible to play in that competition. But for the purpose of this, we're going to make the assumption that everything is fine and that Palace can play in the Europa League, because it's also affected by what happens with Lyon over in France as well. And then Forest representing the Premier League in the Conference League. So a lot of teams playing in Europe next season. That in itself is going to make for an interesting Premier League campaign, isn't it? Because we don't normally have this many teams represented in European football. So in itself, the fact that we've got nearly half of the Premier League playing midweek fixtures is going to make a difference. And you would think might give some advantage to the teams that don't have European football next season.
Yeah, for example, I mean, the first team that comes to mind, Manchester United don't have Europe. Someone like, who else? Like Brighton don't as well. And some of the other teams that don't have their own sales and managerial changes going on. So those two teams could potentially take advantage of 9 competitors being on the continent. But they are 9 because they're amongst the best, aren't they? So...
Yeah, exactly. And that's what makes it hard for us, I think, as FPL managers, isn't it? Because in part you'd go, okay, these 9 teams all playing European football, I'll invest in the other 11. But actually, when you look at what's happening with those, of course, because they've qualified, probably with the exception of Spurs, but because the rest of them have qualified for this, international football, they are the teams that you do want to invest in because they're the teams that had the best seasons last time around. They're the teams that deserve to have qualified, right? So it's tough to know what to do. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at each of these teams in turn, look at the impact that Europe's had on them previously, and what we think that might mean for us in terms of potentially investing in these clubs for the 25-26 campaign. So before we get into that, let's just quickly set out the dates. Now, like last season, the dates don't exactly line up because UEFA have decided that they like to give each competition a bit of breathing space. They like them to have their own moment in the sun, for want of a better way of putting it. Champions League starts a little bit different in the first week because it's over 3 days. So rather than just the normal 2 that we see across the rest of the campaign. So match day 1 is between the 16th and the 18th of September. Match day 2 starts in September, finishes in October from the 30th of September through the 1st of October. And then we have match day 3, the 21st and the 22nd of October, match day 4, the 5th and the 4th and the 5th of November, the 25th and the 26th is for match day 5, match day 6 on the 9th and the 10th, match day 7 into the new year, the 20th and the 21st of January, and then match day 8 right at the end of January. Obviously, everyone plays on the same night on the 28th. Obviously, the playoffs then and the round of 16, the quarterfinals, semi-finals, and the final is played just after the end of the Premier League season on the 30th of May, out in Budapest this time. Hopefully, we'll be there, Mark. You and I could go on a nice little jolly together if Spurs and Newcastle both make it. It's slightly different for the Europa League. So the Europa League matches are played the week after the Champions League starts, so the 25th and the 24th of September. And then obviously those are played on just one night, so the 2nd of October, which does follow the Champions League. And pretty much after that, it does follow the Champions League, so always happening the one day after. That final, obviously interesting to note, happens like it did last time around before the end of the Premier League season. So it happens in the midweek ahead of game week 38. So potential there for some impact if either Palace or Aston Villa make it into that final. Okay. On the back of that then, Mark, add a little look at match day 1. Now, match day 1 of the Champions League, there are some huge games in the Premier League that follow match day 1. For example, game week 5, which is what follows match day 1 of the Champions League, Arsenal have a fixture at home against Manchester City. Liverpool have the Merseyside derby at home against Everton. And Manchester United, who you've already mentioned don't play European football this year, host Chelsea. So clearly, that's got to have an impact, hasn't it, on the way that we think about how we're managing our FPL teams?
Yeah, absolutely. Because certainly looking at Arsenal last season and Man City, they twice faced each other after a Champions League round, and Arsenal got the better. I think the first one was a draw, and then they beat them 5-1 in the second game. So from a Man City perspective, if you're wanting to invest in their assets, you'd be a little bit nervous about game week 5. As well as the usual Pep Roulette stuff. Yeah, it's to have such a big set of games after the first round of Champions League, that could become a problem.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think, you look at it and you go, like, I know from a Spurs perspective, we were terrible. I'm sure you're going to remind me as we go through this pod. We were terrible in the aftermath of Europa League games last season because where our focus was. Now, we don't see that in the same way. Like most teams don't decide we're forgetting everything else that exists and we're really just focusing on this competition. Most teams try and play on both the European and the domestic front. And of course, they may be up the ante with a cup run in the domestic games as well, with the FA Cup or the League Cup or however it is. But we do see a lot of rotation, and particularly with Manchester City, we expect a lot of rotation from Pep at the best of times. But when you have a difficult fixture like that game that they have coming out of the Champions League again, travelling away to Arsenal, you've got to really think about how Pep might play that. Now, he's signed a lot of great players this season, and we've already talked about that. You and I did a video last week about the new signings that we've had so far, and in that there's a big section on Manchester City. So if you want to go and listen to our thoughts on City's new signings, then you can head over and listen to that one when you finish listening to us here. But I think I'm really cautious with over investment in European clubs generally. I like to pick a couple from the big teams, the likes of Liverpool, Man City, if they've got nice fixtures to start the season. But I don't go all in, trebling up on a club because I like to see how that plays out. Now, this year, because it's game week 5 after match day 1, you maybe have the potential if you want to early wildcard that you could heavily invest, knowing then that you can de-invest if you want to based on what happens in the Champions League. And I know, like, for example, with Arsenal, the fixture swing happens really in game week 7, which is almost perfect for getting through the opening game of the Champions League and then looking to invest after that. Now, my reason for having you on this pod, apart from that I just like to chat to you, Mark, is that last season you wrote an article and it was my go-to article a
Oh,
lot last season. It was the one
thanks.
about European football affecting the Big Six. So I'm very much hoping that Neil has set you off on writing that again for this season, or he will as we get closer to the Champions League. In fact, I might go and message Neil and say, Neil, can we have an update on this one, please? It's a really good article, and it basically looked at how each team was affected by their European exploits. Particularly focusing on the big 6 teams. So it looked at like what we might have expected from Spurs. Spoiler alert for those of you that didn't read the article last year, it didn't say that they were going to finish 17th because I don't think anyone could have predicted that. But it did talk about prioritising and the fact that we don't come out of European games quite as well as we would hope that we would. So let's get into it. Liverpool. Let's start there because champions, they're going to be a team that people are going to want to invest in. The Salahs, the Wirtzes, whichever one of the new defenders you fancy, the Kerkezes, the Frimpongs. Do you want to stick with Van Dijk? However you want to invest, they're going to be popular. The fixtures are nice as well. How did you see our football affect them last time around?
The champions were great. I suppose the clue is there. They were good enough to be champions, weren't they? But they had 9 immediate league matches, not including blank 29 because that came straight after one of the round of 16 legs. So the other 9, they won 7, drew 2.
Yeah.
So actually unbeaten in all of them, and that's what a title winning team does. Though they did lose that cup final in blank 29, but
Who is that to, Mark?
I can't remember. As you'd expect, I suppose what part of the strategy is to quickly identify each side's undroppables, whether it's that centre back, whether like Van Dijk in this case, or that attacking talisman like Salah. Like, no matter how deep a squad is, there'll always be those 1 or 2 players who, in such a high pressure environment, needs to always play because every point counts and they're mounting a title challenge. And yeah, as you'd expect, Salah and Van Dijk started all 9 of them. So did Trent, actually, but he's gone. Gravenberch isn't an FPL asset, really. So, and then beyond that, as you'd expect, sort of Gakpo and Darwin, Jota got rotated a lot. Diaz, to be fair, Luis Diaz did start 8 of them, so if he stays, could be reliable, but with Wirtz arriving, we just don't know yet, do we?
No, and I think that's the thing, isn't it? Unlike Manchester City, who we'll talk about in a minute in terms of rotation, like with Liverpool, we have seen less of that. Now, do we think that that will change? Obviously, with the new signings that Liverpool have bought to replace Trent and potentially to either replace Robertson or Simicast or to play alongside them, we do have potentially a couple of players in each of those defensive positions. So whether it's, Kerkez and Bradley, or whether it's Frimpong and Simicast, Robertson, however you want to kind of look at it, there is potential there now that the second defender in each position maybe could come in, depending upon what the game is. Now, wouldn't expect too much rotation for the first Merseyside derby of the season after match day 1. But if the fixtures fall kindly, could we see slot rotating? Yes. But did we see that a lot? Not so much. Like, a lot of the key assets did, like, we didn't see that from Salah last season. Even when we all thought that Salah might need a rest, we certainly didn't see him getting one. So I think we're probably expecting similar again this year. Maybe some slightly more rotation at the back, potentially, depending upon who he plays in each position.
And if the rumoured bid for Marc Guéhi does come off, I mean, on the one hand, you're thinking, don't split up a title-winning centre-back partnership, but with Konate possibly running down his contract. Gake's not going to sign to be a backup. So again, like Van Dijk would be the only safe one, probably in that back line. And then I suppose in goal, Alisson, if he'd stayed fit, might have been the way in, but he didn't.
And I think for me, like looking at Liverpool, obviously they went out early in the Champions League last year, unexpectedly so as well. Like looking at their form in the group, well, it's not the group stage now, but the league stage of the competition, they were phenomenal, right? And then they came up against a PSG side who hadn't really been until the last sort of knockings of that competition, just about making it and qualifying, and then playing out of their skin to go on and win the competition, knocking out both Man City and Liverpool in the process, as well as sorry, not Man City, Arsenal, and as well as Aston Villa. So there was a lot of oh no, it was Arsenal, wasn't it? It was Arsenal and Villa and
And Villa,
Liverpool that they knocked out. That's right. So all three of those English teams getting knocked out by PSG. So I wonder if Liverpool had progressed further in that competition, given the impact of the League Cup run as well, whether we might have seen a little bit more rotation towards the back end of the season, particularly when they'd kind of secured the Premier League title and it became quite clear that they were going to be Premier League champions. If they'd have still been in the UCL by that point, maybe we would have seen a little bit more rotation. But we didn't see them dropping points after the European matches, really. We didn't see much rotation, which makes me feel better about investing in Liverpool straight away because the fixtures are good as well for them to start the season. So my confidence in Slot's team is a lot higher than it is in Manchester with Pep because, well, let's talk about Man City first of all. What impact did we see from them after European games last season?
yeah, they had that really hideous spell, didn't they, in late 2024? Looked into it. It stretched over 13 games in all competitions, one win, nine defeats. And then later on, when they'd sort of, in theory, gotten better, they did lose that 5-1 to Arsenal after the European game. And even the year before, when Man City went on to be champions, they still weren't particularly great post Europe. It was 3 wins from 9, a few high scoring draws. So it'll be interesting actually because now we've had 1 year off the new league phase format. As we sort of said, Liverpool were brilliant in those 8 matches and went out early. And you can finish, 24th and still. So with this new format, does it maybe allow you to not take a foot off the Champions League a bit, but you can still have a below average Champions League, win 3 of the 8 and still be in it come February? So from Liverpool's lesson, is there a particular reason to win all 8 games when, especially game week 5, you've got a tough derby coming up? You could, in theory, slack off in match day 1 and still be in the competition.
Yeah, it's a really interesting way of looking at it, isn't it? Because obviously in the group format that we used to have, you kind of did feel like in the Champions League group stages, there was probably going to be one team that were probably going to go out. And then it was going to be between the other 3 as to who qualified and who dropped into the Europa League. But you didn't want to be that team that dropped into the Europa League. You wanted to be one of the teams that qualified for the next stage of the Champions League. Whereas Liverpool, I think you're absolutely right in what you've just said. Liverpool are a really interesting case for it, aren't they? Because they were so far the best team in the league stages of the Champions League last season. Yet in the knockout rounds, I mean, it's not like they didn't play badly necessarily against PSG, but PSG were just so much the better team in both of those games. I mean, quite frankly, how they won the first of the games, I still don't know. Even watching it with my Liverpool supporting husband, he was like, I'm not quite sure how we've come away from that one in the position that we are. And then, of course, the inevitable felt like it happened in the second game. So maybe there's less pressure for teams like Arsenal, like Man City, who you would expect to make it through to do so. But then again, it does depend on the draw, I suppose, and the teams that you're going to be playing, because getting those points on the board quickly, I think for most managers, they're probably going to look at it and go, right, well, if we go out and win the first 4 games in the Champions League, maybe then we can ease off the accelerator a little bit heading towards those end games. But there's definitely a balancing act, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. I think Man City were 22nd, weren't they? And PSG were very much in the middle, and they went on to win the whole thing. So it's like you see that in international tournaments as well. Sometimes the winning team, there's like an art to knowing when to peak. Some teams are excellent in the groups, some sort of keep that energy for the knockout stage, and you could make a theory that this new format in the Champions League could be for that. As you say, win the first three, slack off the next five, because December in Premier League is quite tough anyway. And what you're still gonna have a fighting chance of winning the competition.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of makes sense. Like, I've been spending a lot of this summer at grassroots tournaments with my eldest one and listening to their coaches. They always talk about start well, go out there, win the first couple. Because if you get a first couple of wins on your belt, the chance of you progressing to the knockout stage of the competition are quite good. And particularly as the weather's been so hot in the UK, it's like, right then, if you pick up a couple of draws in the later games before you hit the knockouts, you're already laughing because you made it through. So you could see that in potential. Now, the one thing about Man City that Liverpool I don't think really have, but Man City definitely do, is the risk of rotation, because off the back of the Champions League, rotation feels like it's going to be rife at Man City, particularly given the new signings that they've brought in this season and the fact that they've got strength in across the board. Really, it feels like now making some fantastic signings, but also some signings that don't really have Champions League experience before, in the likes of Eight Nori. So maybe we might see almost like a league side, a bit like Chelsea last season.
Mm.
Like this is the team that's mostly going to start things in the UCL, and these are the players I'm going to trust with the Premier League. I don't know that Pep will be quite as this and this as Maresca was last season. I don't think I see it quite so black and white at Man City, but I do think we'll see rotation off the back of the Champions League matches. So you
Mm.
probably just need your benches around Man City if you want to treble up or go heavy on them.
And he'll be determined to win the league this year after how last year went. I mean, it was Pep probably took that as a personal hit. So he is
Mm.
not wanting to take any chances in the league. Haaland started 9 of those 10 post Europe last year. Guardiola did it. Foden started 9 of the 10, which for some reason I was surprised by that. It just felt like he was less nailed on last year, but he started a lot of the post European games. Mamouche started all four since arriving in January, but beyond that, as you say, we just don't know with that man.
Yeah. And I guess, in a similar way to Man City being desperate to do well in the Premier League, the same can be said of Arsenal, obviously. Another almost season for Arteta and Arsenal. In both competitions, actually, in the Premier League and also in the Champions League. And they will be desperate to win something, won't they, next season? I think, given the year that they've had and the fact that, around them, Spurs have won the Europa League, Chelsea won the Conference League, Palace went and won the FA Cup. Like, we've seen a lot of the London rivals having a fairly successful season, albeit not necessarily in the Premier League. Spurs, I'm talking about you. But Arsenal will look at that and go, this needs to be our season. We need to win something. And they've got the squad. They've absolutely got the squad, where I'm astounded that they haven't won something more recently than they have. What were they like after European football last time around? Were we seeing a lot of rotation? Were we seeing a lot of defeats, wins, draws?
They coped really well because they had 14 post-European League matches. It was kind of harder to sort of identify who was playing most of the time. But they only lost once of those 14 when Bournemouth won at the Emirates. And there was, as we said, there was a 5-1 over Man City. There was a draw against them, a couple of draws with Liverpool. And it was similar to the season before, 7 wins, 1 draw, 1 defeat. So one thing that Arteta does do quite well is maintain the workload quite well. Not well enough to win a trophy yet, but you feel like they're one striker away from maybe winning something. Rotation-wise, Saka probably would have been nailed if it wasn't for that hamstring injury.
Mm.
Um,
And I think that's the other thing, isn't it? That you look at that with players like Saliba and Gabriel, and they had a lot of injuries, Arsenal, to key assets. And had they not picked up those injuries, then maybe things end differently, particularly in the back end of the season. Defensively, they had a lot of problems, and that was
Mm.
part of the issue, I think, in the Champions League final closing stages.
Yeah, is that similar? Yeah, Gabriel started every time he was fit, so who knows what his final number would have been at the end. Raya did start all 38 league games, Salah on 35. So beyond those and Rice, perhaps the lineups probably are tough to predict, especially as feels like midfielders that keep coming. If I think they're linked with Eze
They
today,
are,
aren't they?
yeah.
So again, that's adding more names to it. So
Yeah, and
uh,
again, it's going to be tough. But I think from an FPL perspective, if you want to go for a Saliba or a Gabriel or a Raya, you'd be fairly confident that even after a
yeah,
Champions League game that you'd get them starting. The same with Saka. If you want to go for Saka in your FPL teams, you'd be fairly confident that you were going to get good match game time out of him in the aftermath of the Champions League, because we didn't really see that rotation in those key assets. You do see it around the edges. And of course, if they go out and sign a number 9, then I would expect that player to be pretty rotation proof as well, because they don't really have a natural replacement in that area necessarily as well. So it will be interesting to see who they do sign over the summer. But yeah, Arsenal, another one like Liverpool, like Man City, where we're not really seeing a huge amount of impact of the Champions League in terms of the game wins on the back of it, but also, with the key assets that we would be talking about from an FPL perspective, maybe we feel a bit safer about investing there. A,
yeah,
a team that's quite hard to judge is Chelsea, because last season, as we mentioned earlier, they were playing in the Conference League. They basically said, here's my Conference League team, here's my Premier League team, and the two shall never meet. That's kind of how it felt, wasn't it? It was like, I mean, they left Cole
yeah.
Palmer out altogether
It
for the league
said
stage.
yeah, Palmer and Lavia. I can't remember who. There was a few big names that purposely were left out for that reason because it was against the likes of Noah and Astana and Shamrock Rovers. And I don't want to cause any disrespect to them, but it's not going to be like that in the
It's not going to be
Champions
like
League
that
for
playing
sure.
Barcelona or Inter Milan or, or PSG or whoever it's going to be. Like, Chelsea aren't going to be able to play this second string team of players and get the same results. So we were expecting a more full strength team from Chelsea in the Champions League. Do we still expect, therefore, there to be rotation, or do we expect Maresca? Because they're signing, it feels like they're in for everybody again, Chelsea. Like, they just seem to have this unlimited conveyor belt of players in just constantly. So, on that basis, are we then expecting continued rotation around the Premier League? I mean, surely Palmer's safe. If you want to buy Palmer, surely you would expect him to play pretty much both competitions.
You'd think that, but then João Pedro's coming in, and he's sort of both a number 10 and a forward, really. So you got Delap and Jackson up front, being linked still with Kudus and Ekatike, and now João Pedro's coming in. So, could this even. Palmer hasn't helped it with his poor league form.
And
Does
Club World Cup form as well, because he's not going any better in
He's not.
pre-season.
It's continuing. It just won't stop. So there is an excuse there to even rest Palmer because it's a ludicrously deep squad that just will not stop getting bigger. Um, and yeah, like I know what you're saying. Like in theory, in terms of attacking talisman, Palmer should be rotation proof, but
Will he be?
£60 million here, £50 million here. These players need to play.
Yeah.
So are
It
any of them safe?
it does feel hard as well, because the Chelsea fixtures to start the season are great. They are
Yeah,
great. So when I know that the game's gonna go live. I'm gonna sit there with the app. I'm gonna have cleared out the auto picks. I'm gonna have a nice team idea of one. And I'm gonna be sat there trying to pick 3 Chelsea players, because it feels like they've got the fixtures to have 3. And I just know I'm going to be looking at it and thinking, one, do I want Palmer? Because likely everyone else is going up in price and Palmer's going to be expensive. He's not going to be cheap and he's not in great form. Then you've got, maybe you go for a defender. Maybe there's a Cucurella pick in there. How much game time is João Pedro going to get? I mean, João Pedro is going to lose penalties. He scored 10 goals last season. 5 of them were penalties. You would expect that he loses those penalties, because surely Ice Cold Palmer is maintaining penalty duty. Um, It's
Don't
tough, isn't
erase
it?
scores. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really tough with Chelsea to know exactly how they're going to be. But I do think that they'll go full strength in the Champions League, and maybe that might lead to a little bit of rotation off the back of it. But then, coming out of match day one of the Champions League into a game away at Manchester United, that's a difficult tie in the Premier League, and they can't afford to be dropping points in the Premier League and falling behind either. So they might have this massive squad, but does Maresca trust that squad enough to deploy them in the Premier League in big games, or to deploy them in the Champions League in big games? I guess that's
Yeah.
what's up for debate.
And we there's no guarantee that top five will get Champions League.
No,
If certainly a couple of years ago, Newcastle and Man United were poor for the coefficient, and with so many teams in it this time, that could almost worsen England's
good.
coefficient. So if it is top four, again, if you're Chelsea, you can't afford to drop any points. We spoke about Liam Delap the other day, and I know you in particular
I'm
are a big
keen.
fan, very keen. And we look at it and say, yeah, he should start game week one because Jackson's suspended. But then,
João
yeah,
Pedro.
like within a few, João Pedro, and then within a few weeks, the Champions League's underway,
I
and
know.
this like 75-man squad needs needs to play.
It's tough. It's really tough. What about your boys then, Mark? This is the moment you've been waiting for. Look, we've got what, half an hour into this pod, and now's your moment to shine. You didn't play European football last season, and you had a phenomenal season as a result of it. Good in the league, obviously won silverware. One of the best seasons that you as a fan have experienced for a very long time.
hmm
But if we go back a year, as you mentioned with the coefficient before, to 23-24, when you did play Champions League football, your Premier League form suffered as a result of it. So sorry to take you back there, but can you just remind us a bit about the last time Newcastle were in Europe?
The draw was very mixed emotions because it was a group with PSG, Milan, and Dortmund, and the initial reaction was, "Wow, like brilliant!"
Games to watch.
And then you immediately think, this is going to be so difficult. There wasn't even one, we'd have taken two of them and an easier one. Nope. The whole thing was difficult. All the attention had to go on those 6 games. And yeah, the squad just wasn't well equipped enough. It started off well. I think it was 8-0 against Sheffield United after the first match, the draw in Milan, but the squad was tiny. It couldn't cope. There was no room to slack off in the Champions League. And at its worst, it was 10 defeats in 15 in all competitions because it was pretty much just the same 11 every few days running on empty. There was one match, I forget where it was. They looked exhausted by kickoff. And so I am a bit worried, especially with the way this summer is going.
I was going to say, it's not a big squad again, is it?
You might have detected with some of those Chelsea lines, them a little bit.
You want some of them. They could sell you a couple of the 75.
They keep stepping in at the last minute and taking away. We desperately need at least 3 new names for the starting 11, but just as important, a couple of players for depth.
Yeah,
absolutely
100%.
depth. Tonali was serving that long ban 2 years ago as well, so the depth is so important, and it hasn't happened yet. The strange thing was though, because Eddie Howe, despite all of this, as I said, they're looking tired by kickoff. You still wouldn't throw in Lewis Hall because he's a big believer in sort of an integration period. So there's a spell of 24 matches where Hall didn't start, mostly as an unused sub, even when the players had absolutely nothing. He still wouldn't throw Hall in. So of course now he's a key player who could start
and we'll be
for
back.
England. Yeah, he seems to be already sort of running again. So he could easily be a starter for England by the World Cup, although Lewis Skelly, I guess, is competition from now. It's a nice debate for Tuchel to have. The squad is not currently equipped to do that. Howe is so reserved when he talks about stuff in the media. And when he said, I think it was on the last weekend of the season, how Newcastle needed to act really, really fast, that seemed a bit out of character. And you're thinking, all right, he really means it. Like the club need to act very, very quickly and get in several players straight away. And here we are on the 1st of July with 0, the absolute opposite of what he said. Now, it's not quite time to panic yet, but, and I'm sure those at least 4 will come in. But as we saw 2 years ago, when it was only 6 league games, not 8 league games, group games, that the squad needs both the quality and the depth. And yeah, from an FPL purpose, it's probably just Isak, perhaps Livramento. But beyond that, the early fixtures don't help either way. It was
No.
a horrible opening run, so I would definitely observe Newcastle.
It does feel like we've been given a bit of a pass with Newcastle to observe how the Champions League affects because of the way the fixtures are to start the season. So it also means that we can see out the transfer window with Newcastle and see who you sign, because there will be signings. There absolutely will be incomings at Newcastle. So I do feel like we are in a position where we can wait. We can wait and see how match day one pans out, how the impact of match day one is. We can see how the Premier League opening starts. If you want to go for Isak because you love Isak, then fair enough. But I don't think that there's a need to invest. On the other side of this, there's my team who, on paper, there looks to be every need to invest, because the fixtures to start the season for Spurs are great. They are great. They're great fixtures. Obviously, Club World Cup, slight shocks aside, Man City have had a busy summer already, and that's Spurs' second game. Now, we love a trip up to the Etihad. Historically, we do incredibly well up there. Whether Thomas Frank will do the same with us as everyone else, well, I guess we're about to find out. But it does feel like it's going to be a year of big change at Spurs. Goodness knows how we've ended up here. Honestly, goodness knows. I've no idea how I'm talking about Spurs playing Champions League football, but I'm living my best life talking about it. I cannot wait to be back in the South Stand on a Thursday night, watching, on a Tuesday night and a Wednesday night, not on a Thursday night, watching my boys. We don't have the same issue to you in terms of squad size, because actually we do have good players, good backup players in every position. But the major issue we had last year, well, we had two. One was that Postecoglou decided it was everything, all eggs in the Europa League basket, which obviously has an impact. And we'll look at the numbers in a minute. I know you've got them of how awful it was for us in the aftermath. I'll let you go there because it's painful for me and you'll enjoy it.
Excited.
But the other problem was injuries. We had a injury ravaged season. So what ended up happening is that we lost a lot of the second, like a lot of our big hitters were out. So then the second players were playing in those positions, and then they were having to play. So we had like players like Archie Gray having to play like multiple minutes week in, week out all the time. And as a kid, like, I mean, that's brilliant, right? It's great experience. Same with Lucas Bergvall. But at the same time, it's not ideal in terms of fitness and all of that kind of stuff. So there was a decision made to pull back on Premier League. Now, this is going to be the first time that Thomas Frank leads anybody into Europe. So it's a bit of an unknown with him as well. Bit of an unknown with Spurs in terms of how we're going to play this competition. I think what is known is that we won't do what we did last year. This will not be a here we go with the Champions League and everything else is forgotten about. That won't be a thing that happens this time around. But everything else feels a bit unknown. Would you like to tell everyone about Spurs' performances after Europe last year, Marc?
Well, I don't want to be harsh to you, Sam, to be honest, because I don't want to bring you down. At least we know it ended with a trophy, so it's not a sad ending or anything.
Ended like this, but, Marc, look. Ended like that.
Exactly like that. So we can say this with a smile. But the 15 post-European matches brought 3 wins, 9 defeats, including home defeats to Ipswich and Leicester.
I was at both of those games, by the way.
Bet you were. And yeah, no team has ever lost more and stayed up in a 38-game Premier League. So,
which is mad, isn't it?
And this is a team that's won the Europa League. It's
Yeah.
going to be in the Champions League. Even now, like a month and a half later, it just seems just crazy to say out loud.
Still like a dream.
The goal difference was really good until the last few weeks as well. It was just
when we literally just went, no, I'm not interested in the league at all. At that point, then the goal difference just kept getting tanked because we just didn't care.
And I think it eventually ended on a negative number, but for a while it just looked so out of place.
It was like plus 22 at one point or something ridiculous, and we were like half.
Yeah.
Like it was ridiculous. Now I do think that we will. I don't think we'll do a Liverpool. Like I don't think we're going to go in there and try and win every game. I think there'll be. I mean, I'm quite excited for Thomas Frank Spurs, to be honest. And obviously we have the Super Cup to play out as well, which is going to give us a little bit of an insight into how Spurs' team holds up against the champions of Europe, the other champions of Europe in PSG. And so that will give us a little bit of an insight into how Spurs might cope in the Champions League. but I think we will prioritize it because we have to. But also, I think we will be not doing. We're more likely to kind of take a bit more of a cautious approach to how we balance that with the league form as well as with the Champions League matches,
Mm,
and of course, the domestic trophies as well because the League Cup kicks off during the course of this. So we will have that as a thing as well because we want to win another trophy again this season because now we've got the taste of it. I don't want to wait 17 more years.
absolutely. Yeah, it's a long time that.
It's a very, very long time. Now, let's move on and talk about the teams in the Europa League. Um, Aston Villa. Aston Villa really struggled during the group stages of the Champions League when it came to their Premier League form. So they only won once during the group stages of the Champions League last time around. They did get 3 draws, but then they lost 4 times in that. And when you look at the games that they lost, I mean, maybe you would expect it. It was Liverpool and Chelsea for one of them, but the derby against Wolves, that's not ideal. I think we would all have expected Villa to have won that one. Uh, but yes, I think I'm kind of interested to see what's going to happen there. They did get better in the knockout stages. After the knockout stages, they were better with their league form. But again, it's a relatively small squad again, isn't it? And last year, reason it got better, I think, is because they did good business in January and got those players out
Hmm.
on loan, and they don't have
Those are
those players now.
they've expired, yeah. So yeah, that's it. Yeah, it was a pretty straight line to draw. That the reason their post-European form got better was because they got more players,
Mm.
really good quality. The depth was very impressive for Villa. They beat Newcastle 4-1 after one of them. And I think the season before, when they reached the Conference League semis, they generally followed those quite well as well. But as you say, I think the only noticeable off day on that campaign was when they lost 4-0 to Spurs.
Yay!
Throw that one
Yeah,
in for
but
you.
I think it is interesting, isn't it, with Villa because I do like Emery is so good. He's so good in European
Yeah,
football, but he has lost those additional players that he brought in. And when you think about the impact of like Rashford and Asensio and those guys on not just the European exploits, but also in the Premier League, the ability to rotate players, rest players, give players reduced minutes. Not that he really did that with Morgan Rogers, but with everybody else there was that potential. So, I mean, I think this year go with Morgan Rogers again, absolutely, because he feels like he is the one that avoids the rotation. But with Villa, I think it's a bit of a who are they going to sign in the summer and who are they going to lose as well? Like who's going to be going out? Was that Emi Martinez's last time? Because we know how Emi Martinez has changed games, particularly in Europe for Aston Villa before now as well, keeps them in things massively well. Um, so yeah, I do worry a little bit about Villa that we might see
mm,
what we saw. I mean, maybe not as badly because the Europa League games are a slightly different level to the Champions League ones, obviously. So maybe we don't need to have quite so heavy exploits in the Europa League for them as we did in the Champions League, but they did struggle until they filled that squad up in January. So
yeah.
if we're
They need to
going
be
into it smaller again, it could be a problem.
they need to be smart in the transfer market. But you'd expect them to be one of the Europa League favourites, genuinely. And as well as Rodgers, I mean, Ollie Watkins lost Duran as competition, and he's lost Rashford as potential competition now. So Watkins could be a good name to start off with, but again, now that the new financial year started, we might start to see names
Bit more.
arrive at Villa, and depending on that, how much competition will Watkins have? We will find out.
We will indeed. Now, Crystal Palace, as we mentioned right at the beginning of this, that their position in the Europa League is still not fully secured yet. Issues around their ownership, although the owner is selling the club or his shares in the club anyway to avoid that. Lyon have now been relegated to the second tier of French football. If they're appealing that relegation. If that relegation is upheld, then they've said that they will pull out of the Europa League, which I find interesting in itself. And obviously that will have an impact on Crystal Palace as well because of the ownership is between those two clubs. This is going to be Palace's first time in Europe. Let's just assume everything is fine and they get to play it. It will be their first time, first campaign. It's quite hard to know what to expect, really, isn't it? I guess we can sort of compare it to their FA Cup campaign a little bit, although the FA Cup was different because obviously it had its own standalone weekends, but they did obviously have those additional matches. What do we think? Because this is a small squad as well. This Palace team is
Yeah,
little, and if they do lose some of these players that are being muted with moves away, the likes of Eze, I worry for them.
I do slightly worry a bit. I mean, briefly touching back on Spurs for a moment there, because while Thomas Frank has very little experience of the European workload, and
The players know.
yeah, the players know. And last season at Brentford, he started. I became familiar with Brentford last season. He started 7 players at least 34 times. You can't do that at Spurs, but at Palace, you got Glasner, who won the Europa League. So even with Frankfurt, so even though Palace, this is sort of unknown territory for them, this is like an exciting adventure. They have a head coach who won the Europa League a couple of seasons ago, and that should help them. But if they lose one or both of Eze or Guehi, it could get a little bit uncomfortable on the league form. And I love a bit of Daniel Munoz, for example, but I
Oh, me
think
too.
might have to stay away for a bit, really.
Yeah, it feels like it, doesn't it? And a little bit like that with Forest as well. Obviously, they're the final club playing European football for the Premier League sides this season. They're going to be playing in the conference. So you kind of sit here and go, oh, great, they'll be able to do what Chelsea did. Except the Forest squad is tiny. So they can't have what Chelsea did because they just don't have that many players. So it could be difficult, not because I think that they'll struggle in those matches, because actually I think they've got a really, if they play like they did last year in the Premier League, I think they have got a really good chance in the conference because they could do incredibly well there. My worry is, can those players go all the way in a competition alongside pretty much playing every week in the Premier League?
It feels a bit like the time in 2018 when Burnley finished seventh and qualified for Europe, but then they just escaped relegation the next year with Chris Wood up front, by the way. And Newcastle had a season like that as well. I think they fluked fifth place on the
Spurs did.
Pardew, then came 16th after that. So yeah, Spurs, and could Forest be that latest team that
Yeah.
great season,
It's
just
the same with
escaped
Brighton
relegation.
as well, wasn't it? I remember when Brighton were in Europe a couple of years ago, they really struggled in the Premier League. It's that we're a little team, not in terms of stature, but in terms of actual the number of players that they have in their squads. When you don't have that ability to rotate, you're asking a lot of the players to play every game in the midweek, plus the League Cup start. So you've got to consider that in the group stages, plus the Premier League games. And then when you get into the new year, obviously you've got the FA Cup. If you've stayed in the European competition, you've still got that to contend with. If you're still in the League Cup, there's potentially a huge amount of fixtures for a squad where you would expect, the Gibbs Whites, the Chris Woods, the Elangas, if still there, to be pretty much ever present in those teams. And that's a big ask.
Yeah, it doesn't help that the Forest season ended with a bit of a whimper because they really did look like they were going to get one of the Champions League spots. And while the final position wasn't disappointing, you could see why some fans might have maybe dreamt a bit and been a bit knocked back. So they've ended it in not great form, and there isn't the squad really as we speak today that can compete with both competitions. Elanga is being linked to Newcastle. I don't know if, I mean, that could make it worse for them, but maybe they need that money to spread across 4 or 5 new signings to cure the depth. It could be seen both ways, really. But their opening fixtures aren't too bad, though, are they?
They're quite nice, particularly from a defensive perspective. Like, I looked at them and thought, Nottingham Forest defender feels like a good opportunity. Now, of course, we do have that little bit of extra time because they don't start until later. So we do get the extra fixtures. So if you're planning a wild card in and around game week 7 for the Arsenal swing, then actually Nottingham Forest can still be a really nice investment because you don't have to worry about the conference for that little bit longer. But it does feel like it will be a really interesting season to watch Forest, and particularly the first couple of games coming out of the conference. I'm going to be interested to see what their team sheet looks like in that competition, but also what impact that has on the Premier League team sheet that follows, because I actually think that they might be quite similar. Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah, it'd be a bit of a worry. All right, Mark, overall then, I think what we're saying is Liverpool, Arsenal, even to a certain extent, Newcastle and City, if you pick the players wisely, if you pick the Salahs and the Sakas and the Gabriels and the Isaks, you're fairly safe.
The big ones,
yeah. Then you're fairly safe. We're not expecting a lot of rotation. Once we get down into the kind of Spurs territory, it's a bit more difficult to work out who is going to be the best picks anyway. I also read your article. that I very much enjoyed on Thomas Frank at Spurs and the potential for Solanke to be a hit. Very much enjoyed that one. If we don't really have a replacement for him, so if he ends up being that person, because Brentford traditionally like shot in the box, then he could be one in both competitions, but it's a bit more difficult to call. And from Spurs down, I feel like it's hard because whilst we might see less rotation from those sides because we get less strength in depth at the likes of Villa and Forest and Palace, we also are going to see those players playing a lot of minutes, and therefore maybe that puts us off investing from an FPL perspective.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's it. Yeah, it's the better teams are the ones that are playing more, so it's a bit of a contradiction.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be a fun season, isn't it? With 9 Premier League
Hopefully,
sides all playing in Europe, with your team and my team. I think whatever happens, it's going to make for a really, really interesting Premier League season. Just make sure that as far as you can, you're being cautious by investing too heavily in those 9 clubs. Make sure that the ones you get are the ones that are likely to start, and also the ones that are less likely to be hit by sides that struggle coming out of a European game because they don't have that strength in depth.
and I look forward to our trip to Budapest for the final.
You and me on that plane to Budapest. We'll come back for a little bit. One of us will be happy, one of us will be sad. Then we'll shoot off to the States to watch England win the World Cup. Sounds like the perfect summer.
All of this is going to happen. Yeah.
In our dreams. Brilliant. Thank you ever so much for joining me today, Mark. If you have enjoyed this video and this podcast, then drop us a like and make sure that you have subscribed to the channels so that you are notified the next time the content drops. Mark, I will talk to you soon.
Speak soon.